And me witnessing domestic violence growing up, I remember just like cops being around, and I remember like situations were very, very confusing, and sometimes we wouldn't see my parents for like a day or two, and just kind of figuring out what's going on. So in this video here, you will learn the 5 myths about domestic violence. Now, domestic violence is one of those things that we don't talk about, and sometimes it's like this very taboo situation, especially when we talk about mental health. But there's a lot implied when we talk about domestic violence, trauma, and other mental health symptoms. What's going on, y'all? Terrence, the therapist here. Thank y'all for tapping in. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe to the channel so you know when these videos are about to drop. So I felt like it was super important to talk about domestic violence, especially it being Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October. Now, domestic violence, again, is one of those taboo things. It's not something we really talk about in mental health, but it is a real thing in our society. Domestic violence is a real thing in our society. So this is going to come from what I've experienced witnessing domestic violence, and maybe some things that you guys experienced witnessing domestic violence. I will say this is a trigger warning right here. This topic is a very, very sensitive topic. This topic is a very sensitive topic. So be mindful about this video. Be mindful of any triggers or any things that come up for you. It's always good to be informed about your triggers, and especially when it comes to like mental health and domestic violence, it's very important to be informed about how you're feeling and being just aware about how you're feeling about certain topics and certain issues. Now, there are some resources in my description, so be sure to utilize those resources if anything comes up for you, because I want to make sure that I do inform you guys about these myths, but I also don't want to re-trigger anybody, nor do I want to misinform you. I want to give you guys the raw facts around domestic violence. So the 5th myth around domestic violence is domestic violence only happens to women. All right, so I hear this a lot, especially when it comes to domestic violence. And automatically, even when you guys saw this video, you guys probably thought, oh, we're going to talk about men hitting women. And it's like, that's a huge myth. That's a huge myth. Domestic violence doesn't only happen with a man abusing the women. Now, there are more cases of that, right? There are more cases. That's just the facts. There are more cases of men abusing women. But there are recorded cases, which is about 25% of men report being domestically abused by their female spouse. Now, this is one thing I also highlight, especially me being an advocate for men's mental health, that we do have to recognize and realize that domestic violence doesn't only happen to women, it happens to men as well too. And I feel like there is that, okay, if a woman hits me, I shouldn't say anything, or, you know, I'm less than a man if I report domestic violence. But you also have to realize too, fellas, like, we have to take care of ourselves. We have to take care of our mental health. Just as much as not okay for a man to hit a woman, it is not okay for a woman to ever put hands on a man either. The key part of that is 1/4 of men, 25%, again, do report domestic violence. The 4th myth I'm gonna break down for you guys is domestic violence is only a physical act, right? So we use the word domestic violence, right? What do we think about when we think about violence? We think about physical abuse, we think about sexual abuse, we think about physical fights, we think about anything that has to do with anything physical, right? Because violence is what we see as like physical, right? Like somebody harming somebody else, right? But why is that a myth? Like, why is domestic violence being physical only a myth, right? Because that's what we think about. We think about domestic violence being violent. But think about it this way. Domestic violence is not limited to a physical activity. Domestic violence also has emotional and psychological components to it as well too. You may have been in a situation where you experienced or witnessed domestic violence and not have even known it. Domestic violence does not only come in the form of, you know, physical altercations. It could come in verbal abuse. It could come in emotional abuse. And I know a lot of folks are like, that's not a real thing. Like, nah, verbal abuse and emotional abuse is a real thing, right? Because it does have to do with your psychological makeup, and it has to do with how you interpret the world around you, right? So if you're hearing things constantly over, like, oh, you ain't nothing, you're not gonna ever be anything, you're disgraced, nobody's ever gonna love you, and all these different negative things and all these mentally abusive phrases, that is a form of domestic violence. That is a form of domestic violence. And I know there's gonna be a lot of pushback on this, which I don't really care. I wanna, again, give you guys the raw dog around this. Like, that is a hostile situation. That is a form of domestic violence. Now, Sometimes, again, it's not seen as domestic violence. So if you're experiencing that, and sometimes you may call like the police or anything like that, the first thing you're going to ask, like, has anybody been harmed? Most of the times when you have law enforcement involved in domestic violence situations, even if it's a verbal altercation, there has to be some form of intervention. So let's look at the consequences. What are the consequences of these emotional and psychological implications, right? Because the implications of that is trauma, right? How do you think somebody would feel around somebody who has been mentally abusing them the whole time, right? There's going to be triggers, there's going to be responses, there's going to be, physical responses, there's going to be anxiety, there's going to be a lot of depression, there's going to be a lot of worry. There's going to be a lot of different things that happen, especially when we talk about the psychological. And if you think about this, right, we don't always remember what people have done to us per se. We don't always remember like what people have done to us, but we always remember like how they made us feel. Like we don't always remember what they say to us, but we always remember like how they feel, right? Think about somebody that you haven't seen in like maybe 10 years or something like that. You may not remember all those conversations that you had, but you may remember how that person made you feel. So when we talk about the psychological impact and the emotional impact on domestic violence, it's not always like a physical impact. Like, we have emotional scars that we have to heal from, just as we may have physical scars. The third myth is domestic violence only happens in straight couples. All right, so this one I want to break down just a bit, because I know sometimes when we think about domestic violence, we think about heterosexual marriages or couples, but also there's a high rate and there's a high reportage of members of the LGBTQ plus community also experiencing domestic violence as well too, right? This even goes back to the fifth myth, where domestic violence is implied by the sex of a person or the gender of the person. It's really defined by two people who coexist and that get into a feud, right? So it doesn't mean like, a man has to hit a woman or a woman has to hit a man. It could be a woman hits a woman or a man hits a man. Like all those things can be still considered domestic violence. Just because they're not in a heterosexual relationship doesn't mean that they don't experience domestic violence. The second myth I'm gonna break down to you guys is that it's easy to get out of a domestic violence relationship. It is easy to get out of a domestic violence relationship. Is it? Let's break this down a bit, right? Many times when people are reporting domestic violence, there's a lot of things that are involved for somebody to actually get up and leave a situation where they're being a victim of domestic violence, right? Because again, domestic violence happens usually in the home or somebody that you live with, right? So now you have to think about, okay, where am I gonna live? Can I afford where I'm gonna live at? Because I may have been like splitting the rent or the mortgage with that person, or that person may have been paying for it all and I don't really have the resources to do so. Are the kids involved? Like what happens if I leave? Do I take the kids with me, or do they stay here? Like what happens? And me witnessing domestic violence growing up, I remember just like cops being around, and I remember like situations were very, very confusing, and sometimes we wouldn't see my parents for like a day or two and just kind of figuring out what's going on, like maybe a week or so, right? All those things have to be taken into consideration when we talk about, okay, it's easy to leave a domestic violence situation. Like, why don't you just get up and leave? And sometimes we get this Hollywood mentality. We see these movies where people up and leave and they go to another city and they start all over and they're doing, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't always work like that. There's a lot of things, not even just like financially a situation be moved around, but you have to like really prepare yourself to like live a new life. Like if you're leaving a situation, like people are like, oh, why don't you just get out of that situation? It's not that easy. You know what I mean? It's not that easy. There's a lot of planning that has to be involved, right? So a lot of people do get shamed for staying in domestic violence relationships, but you have to understand like there's a lot that is implied, not even just with the finances, but also psychologically as well too. Like you have to think about, what do they see a healthy relationship? Like myself have witnessed like domestic violence and just see it as a normal thing, but outside looking in, we see it as like being a shameful act. Like, oh, okay, why are you staying in that situation, right? So that's why it's super important to understand and recognize these myths, because sometimes we're in situations and we don't really know how to navigate it because we're so locked into our own world. Like, again, understanding like what is domestic violence, right? Like what is domestic violence? Domestic violence can be a lot of different things, right? So this is why we talk about what are the myths of domestic violence. And the number one myth is it is the victim's fault that they're in that domestic violence relationship, and which is absolutely not true. Domestic violence is never justified in any form or fashion or any situation or circumstance. Domestic violence is not ever the victim's fault. The perpetrator may say things like, oh, you drove me to this point, or look at all the stuff you did, like look what you made me do, right? So like that's like some I can Tina Turner stuff, you feel me? Like it is never the victim's fault that they are being domestically abused. You know what I mean? They're experiencing domestic violence. That is not the consequence. I don't care how bad the situation, the relationship is. There's never justified that it is never the victim's fault that they are experiencing domestic violence. Hope this video was helpful in breaking down the myths around domestic violence. Again, if there's anything that resonated with you, or if there's any triggers or anything like that that you experience, make sure you hit the information in my description so that you get the help that you deserve. And if you are feeling triggered and not knowing if you should start therapy or not, make sure you check out my ebook, which is in the description. It gives you self-assessment. It gives you also how to navigate around finding a therapist. All right. Thank you guys for tapping in. Terrence, your therapist. Peace.